Well, good evening, everybody. Great to see you all. Great to see a whole bunch of familiar faces coming back for more excitement on the 2020 presidential campaign, which is well underway, as we all know. And so I want to thank the University of Puget Sound Alumni Council, who is sponsoring the event. Thank Media Relations, who's been great on helping with the technology. The Office of Alumni Relations has been wonderful in terms of coordinating all of the event. They're responsible for the refreshments out in the hallway there. And so we've titled this series 2020 Battle for the Soul of America. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. And we'll talk about this map a little bit later on as well. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Mike Purdy. I'm a presidential historian. And since we last met in 2016, I've written a book. Those of you who are here remember that we would start out each session with some insults that presidents had traded with other presidents. And so I took 101 of those and put them into a book. 101 presidential insults, what they really thought about each other, and what it means to us. And so it's got these insults. They're all grounded in history. I've documented them. And then I try to make the case in the introduction that we need to figure out as a country, how do we create a more civil society, and how do we talk about things like that? So we will, I'll have books for sale afterwards, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute.
I'm Dr. Michael Artime. I'm department chair and assistant professor of political science at Pacific Lutheran University. I didn't write a book, but I had a baby, and that's my excuse for not writing a book. And I appreciate you all coming back. I'm sure you're here to have me give very correct predictions about what is going to happen in 2020, just like 2016.
Okay. So what we're going to do is, yes, sir.
Yeah, Mike, excuse me. We're all adults, but this is what I tell my students: all cell phones, vibrate, please.
Yes, thank you.
It just breaks the,
Good reminder. Make sure your cell phone is on vibrate. Thank you. So as we go through the evening, Michael and I are going to talk for roughly an hour. We don't know how long. We haven't figured that out yet. And then we'll have a period of time for questions and answers. We want to make this a nonpartisan type of event, but we also want it to be based on facts, and we want to bring in historical perspective as well to talk about what has happened in the past. So we've set up 7 lectures. Now, if this year's presidential campaign, or next year, 2020, is anything like what happened in 2016, well, we may end up adding some additional lectures as well. So, but it's pretty calm right now, so we probably won't add, No. So we've got them timed around some key events. So for example, February 6th will be just a couple of days after the Iowa caucus. So we'll have a sense of what's happening with the Democratic field and who's pulling out in front there. And then the October 22nd one is the date for one of the general election debates. And assuming there is a general election debate, that's an open question perhaps. And so we'll figure out exactly how we're going to manage that. It may be partially watching it here and partially lecture and discussion. And as we get closer, we'll deal with those details. And the November 5th one will be a couple of days after the election. So it'll be a time to kind of figure out what happened. And now you'll notice that one of the differences about this lecture series from 2016 is we do not have topics for each one. at least not topics that we're publicizing ahead of time. And that's because things are moving so quickly. And we thought it really wouldn't be very effective if we came up with topics and what's really going on is so different. So we're going to be flexible as we go through this. Tonight we're going to focus on impeachment and the impact on the 2020 race. We're also going to look at the Democratic race a little bit and make some comments on that. I suspect we'll be continuing to talk about impeachment. We'll be continuing to talk about what's happening with the Democratic race, but things are just going to unfold, and we'll figure out how that works. We are videoing this session and hope to have it up on my website, PresidentialHistory.com, under resources. So for tonight, we're going to talk about optimism, pessimism, and the present reality. This is where Michael rubs in that I was wrong in 2016 about
Looking forward to it.
being optimistic. We'll talk about key dates in 2020. We'll look at the Democratic race. We'll look at previous presidential impeachments or resolutions that have been introduced in the past. We will compare the past with today in terms of impeachment, and then we'll do an analysis of what is going on currently today from an impeachment perspective. We'll do some questions and answers, and I've got my books for sale here. If you are interested afterwards, I can take cash, check, credit card. It's $11.95 plus tax, so it comes to $13.17. So if you're interested in that, that's great. We'll do that afterwards, and I'm glad to sign it for you as well.
Okay.
Michael.
Great, thanks. So this is the one of the pictures that we used last time when we were here lecturing. And we were we had set up that lecture as, I was presenting the very pessimistic take about what would happen in the next 4 years, and Mike was presenting the optimistic take. So when he's talking about me kind of rubbing it in, this is me saying that I was just right. I mean, DC doesn't look quite like that, but I would argue that at least sort of metaphorically, this makes a lot of sense. And I presented several reasons why I was pessimistic. So looking back over my notes last time, I said that Trump's temperament was sort of ill-suited for the presidency. Check. The elevation of white nationalism and white nationalist thinking, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Danger to non-citizens. The sort of lack of forward momentum on issues related to climate change and potential issues related to corruption. And so those were some of the things that I was worried about the last time that we met. Mike, I'll just present kind of a summary of Mike's reasons for optimism. And I think there's still some things that we can kind of draw out from that. And so he presented this quote last time: optimism isn't principally an analysis of present reality, it's an ethic. It is not based on denial or rosy thinking. It is a moral posture toward the world we find ourselves in. If everything seems great, there's no need for optimism. The river of good news just carries you along. And I think there's still a place for us to find ways that we can at least have enough hope in optimism to continue to be engaged. And so I'll talk about that in just a moment. Mike also said that we could respond with civility and find areas of common ground with each other. He said that Trump was kind of a blank slate and could be convinced about different things. And to some extent, that's been the case, although, being a blank slate also has come with some repercussions depending on who is the last person that he is talking to. And so he also said that we can have hope based on historic advancements that this country has made over time, and then he ended with a prayer for reconciliation. And I think there's a lot of really meaningful things that we can still draw from that, ways that we can orient ourselves to the current political reality that at least might make it a more livable space for us. And so before getting into all of the reasons why I am pessimistic, I'll just say, one of the encouraging things is seeing how people individually have responded in the last 4 years. So think about the day after the inauguration in 2017, 3 to 5 million people attended events throughout the United States, the Women's March. There were various marches throughout the country. That's actually about 1 to 1.6% of the total population of the United States that day was out marching, and these were not violent marches. These were marches of solidarity and expressing, in a peaceful way, a belief about a certain set of common ideals. Globally, the participation in that movement was about 7 million people, which is really extraordinary. And as we think about activism, I recently read a book by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark, and in that she talks about the potential for finding community in moments of struggle, essentially, and looks at instances like natural disasters or immediately after 9/11, when people in the midst of really extreme suffering see each other for who they really are and develop communities. And I think that there's ways in which we have seen that happen. I'm also thinking of, right after the travel ban was first instituted, and you saw, lawyers and people that just in the middle of the night started, traveling to airports and were protesting and advocating on behalf of people who might be impacted by that policy. And so while I am sort of comforted in some ways by the reaction that individuals and activists have had in the last 4 years, I'm a little bit pessimistic on some other fronts. So, I talked about potential legal issues in the administration. I think that is something which has come to fruition. The Mueller report, did not exonerate the president. In fact, it kind of laid out a very convincing case for obstruction of justice. It's just that you don't indict a sitting president, at least according to what the Department of Justice guidelines currently say. And this is in addition to a number of criminal charges being brought against people who were close to the president, including Michael Cohen, with whom Trump might have violated campaign finance laws in making the payments to Stormy Daniels. In addition, there's questions of corruption related to Trump properties, and so the total payment to Trump properties since 2016 by politically affiliated groups is about $19 million. This is according to OpenSecrets.com, which tracks that information. Additionally, he has spent personally about a third of his presidency at these properties, which means that taxpayer dollars are going to support not only his stay there, but also the stay of every Secret Service agent who would be there protecting the president. And so, for those who are afraid that this would be a way in which he would enrich himself through the presidency, I think that there's at least evidence that has happened. Whether or not that is an intentional enrichment, that is a debate that we can have, but there doesn't seem to be any question that more money is flowing into these properties as a result of his position in the White House. One of the hardest things to talk about and to have seen in the last 4 years is the child separation policy. And I kind of want to move through the timeline of that just a little bit so that we're all on the same page when we have conversations about this. So really began in May of 2018 when Jeff Sessions announced a zero tolerance policy on migrants crossing the border without permission, including asylum seekers who are legally allowed to seek refuge in the United States. The no tolerance policy would say that if you crossed over the border without permission, you would be immediately sent to the DOJ for prosecution. Undocumented asylum seekers were imprisoned, and if they had children, those kids were then sent to HHS, and then HHS sent them to about 100 different facilities through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. In June 15th of 2018, DHS publicly acknowledged that they had separated nearly 2,000 children. 2 days later, Kristen Nielsen, who was at the time Homeland Security Secretary, denied that the policy existed, but then 3 days later, Trump signed an executive order that stopped the policy. In June 26, 2018, a district court judge announced an injunction requiring children under 5 to be reunited with families within 30 days. But 1 month later, more than 900 parents had yet to be reunited with their children. On March 9th of 2019, the Trump administration reported in a federal court filing that they had separated 245 children since the executive order was signed. And on April 6th of 2019, the government said that it could take up to 2 years to fully reunite children with their families. During this time, there's a lot of stories about things that were occurring while children were in detention. What we know is that at least 7 children died during detention as a result of these policies. And so, at least when I think about reasons to be sort of pessimistic, this is very, very high on the list. Another is one of the things that we talked about last time that we got together, the rise of anti-Semitism and white nationalism. This is a picture from the Unite the Right rally in August of 2017 in Charlottesville that was happening around the Robert E. Lee statue there. Ostensibly, the march was about the removal of that statue from the grounds, but the movement was led by Richard Spencer. The group was largely consisting of white men carrying tiki torches and chanting anti-Semitic statements. There was a counter-protest that arose in response to that, and Heather Heyer, who was a 32-year-old, was killed when James Field, a Nazi sympathizer, drove his car into a group of those counter-protesters. This is one incident in many that could be described as anti-Semitic. In the last handful of years, a report by Tel Aviv University's Cantor Center with the European, and in conjunction with the European Jewish Congress, found that anti-Semitic violence was up 13% from where it was in 2017. Additionally, in the US, the Anti-Defamation League identified that attacks against Jews more than doubled in 2018 compared to 2017. And 2018 was the 3rd highest year on record for these kinds of attacks since they had been doing that record keeping in the 1970s. And you can probably think of maybe one of the more prominent examples of that was the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, where 11 people were killed. And so, as we think about the title for this, there's a lot to unpack there as we consider the soul of America. And essentially, what we're talking about here is who are we as a nation? Are we a welcoming nation? Are we willing and able to respond to these big crises, things like climate change? One of the things that I didn't talk about here, but we touched on last time we got together was this major problem that we're trying to address through climate change. The Paris Agreement said that we needed to reduce CO2 emissions by 45% from 2010 levels, and we're not even close to moving down that road. And each year that we don't do something makes it that much harder to solve the problem going forward. And so it is a problem which is only getting worse. We also have to ask questions about to what extent character and ethics matter when considering whether somebody should be a political leader. As we think about these groups that I was discussing just a moment ago, do we care about civil rights and civil liberties? It's important that we ask these questions. And one of the things that I'd like to note is that these questions are not, they may have partisan implications, but they're not particularly ideological questions. This is not a question of liberal versus conservative. This is a question that goes sort of beyond that, about fundamentally what things do we believe as a people. And I think that we can think about that even above politics. So it's not ideological versus conservative. We often think of this as about debates between Republicans and Democrats, but I would encourage us as we consider these issues to think at a higher level than just our own sort of partisan or ideological dispositions. And so I'm going to turn things over to Mike now, who's going to help us think a little bit more about the title and provide some historical context to our conversation about impeachment.
Thank you, Michael. So we had this map up on the very cover slide when we opened. This is a map from the 2016 election by county, and the darker the red of the county, the more Trump won that county. The darker the blue on the county, the more Hillary Clinton won that county. You'll notice there's a couple of all blue states, Hawaii and Massachusetts, totally blue, no county in there went for Trump. All red states where no county went for Clinton include Alaska, West Virginia, and Oklahoma. All of the other states were a mix, although you can see there's a lot of red. So this reflects one of the divides in our country. We're obviously a very polarized nation, but one of the divides is between urban and rural. And so you look at a lot of the red there, and that is where these are sparsely populated areas generally, and they're places that Trump won. So a few interesting statistics. So Trump won about 2,600 counties versus Clinton winning 500 counties. So again, counties that have a very low population base are often in what we typically call red states, and so Trump would have won those. So Trump won about 84% of the geographic portion of the country. Clinton ended up winning 88 of the 100 largest counties, including Washington, D.C. If she hadn't won those, without those largest counties, she would have lost by about 11.5 million votes. As it turns out, obviously, Clinton won by something like 3 million votes. So the other thing to think about is you look down at Texas. So Texas has the most counties of any state, 254 counties. So this is the map that we saw in 2016. It's the map that we're going to be playing with in 2020 as well, because we got some real realities here about urban versus rural. We've got a number of states, you've probably heard, that had Trump lost Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Clinton would have won the presidency. And he only won those 3 states by less than 78,000 votes total. So it was in some ways a very close election. So in some ways we're going to be looking at these Rust Belt states, but there's a lot of other states in play as well in 2020. Texas is starting to turn a little bit purple. Arizona's up for grabs. Of course, Florida and Ohio are always key states, and so those are things that we're going to be looking at carefully. But this shows a very polarized nation. This is the battle for the soul of America. And I'd go back to what Michael said. What kind of nation do we want to be? Who are we as a people? And those are important questions. The other thing that, from the title of this lecture series, 2020 Battle for the Soul of America, Joe Biden has made this part of his theme song. And so he says we're in a tight race, no one can deny that, but I still believe we're in the best position to beat Donald Trump and win the battle to restore the soul of our nation. Now, obviously, not everybody agrees with that. There are many, many people in this country who think that if a Democrat wins the presidency in 2020, that they have lost the battle for the soul of America. So we've got a lot of tensions going on. I don't know if any of you have read this book by John Meacham. It's called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. It's a really good book, and what he does is he takes an optimistic view, Michael. He takes the view that we have been in troubled times in the past, and he goes through some of those troubled times that we've been in, and he talks about how we've moved forward a couple of steps and then backwards a couple of steps, but always there's been forward movement in terms of recognizing people's rights. So this is kind of a theme, I think, that we're going to end up seeing in the election. So let's talk about 2020. What's going to happen? We have no idea. But let's look at some of the key dates that are coming up. So we've got Democratic debates that are basically occurring on a monthly basis, and they continue to winnow down the field on who is eligible for those debates. The November debate, last I heard, Amy Klobuchar has now qualified, so now we've got 9 candidates. The October 15th debate, of course, had 12 candidates on stage. So we'll see how, if it stays at 9, or what ends up happening with that. Iowa caucus on February 3rd will be a key date for us to see what's going to be happening, who's going to come out in front on the Democratic side. You've seen all the polls that are coming out, and they're different every day. And I'll talk about polls in just a minute. New Hampshire primary, which is also foundational, February 3rd. Nevada Democratic caucuses, February 22nd. South Carolina Democratic primary, February 29th. So that's going to be really important for Joe Biden, who may end up losing Iowa and New Hampshire to Elizabeth Warren or somebody else. But Biden at this point kind of has a firewall with the African American community in South Carolina, who at this point have not deserted him. So he may come out very well on that one, but it remains to be seen. And what we have to remember in politics, that a week, a month, a day is an eternity, and that there's a lot of things that can change and reshape a race. Super Tuesday, March 3rd, when we've got many, many states with their primaries. Washington State primary, March 10th. And then we've got the Democratic Convention in Milwaukee, July 16th or 13th through 16th. The Republicans meet the following month in August in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the general election debates are set. You know, I think it is an open question, perhaps, whether President Trump agrees to debate. Don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. Nothing would surprise me right now. And then election day on November 3rd, of course. So as of October 21st, just a few days ago, and I don't have the most recent poll, which is probably different, you had one poll, the Suffolk University USA Today poll, had Biden at 18%, Elizabeth Warren at 17%, so they're neck and neck. Pete Buttigieg had jumped up to 13%, so probably largely the result of a very strong debate performance on October 15th. And he's getting a lot more press as perhaps the mainstream centrist alternative to Joe Biden. So that's where he's trying to position himself. Bernie Sanders is dropping, so Bernie Sanders' heart attack didn't help him. That ended up raising questions about his age. It also raises questions about Joe Biden's age. They're roughly the same age. Sanders, I think, is a year older than Biden, but still, they would be by far the oldest presidents ever elected. Elizabeth Warren would be the oldest president ever elected if she won the presidency. Kamala Harris, has been stuck in low digits all along. She had a bump after the first debate, and where she went after Biden, but hasn't been able to gain the momentum back. Amy Klobuchar is kind of in the same lane as Pete Buttigieg, trying to be the centrist alternative to Joe Biden. So if something happens with Biden, if he falters, if he has a health issue, if he says something that's not very politic and he has a tendency toward gaffes, then Klobuchar is waiting there, but Buttigieg probably has a better shot at it, based on the most recent polls. Tom Steyer and Tulsi Gabbard at 3%, and then all of the others are even lower percentages. Congressman Tim Ryan just dropped out of the race today. So I don't know what we're down to, 18, I think, still running, something like that. And then we have to think about what's the impact on Biden with the whole controversy with Ukraine. And is that tainting him? Are people concerned about Biden's lack of energy, his lack of really maybe addressing the Ukraine issue with his son Hunter more forthrightly? These are all moving parts, and things are going quickly. So we'll see how that plays out. So we want to focus a lot on impeachment tonight because that's kind of in the news. So I want to think about historically what has happened with impeachment in our country. So the first impeachment resolution that was introduced against a president was John Tyler, who was our 10th president. He's also known as His Excellency because he was the first president to become president after the death of a president, in this case William Henry Harrison, who died after just 30 days in office. Many people said back then that, well, Tyler, you're just acting president. You're not really the president. And Tyler asserted, no, he was really the president. And that then became the tradition, and that's now actually codified in the 25th Amendment. So first threat of impeachment against Tyler, and what did they end up saying about Tyler in that impeachment resolution? So they did it on the grounds of his ignorance of the interest and true policy of this government and want of qualification for the discharge of the important duties of President of the United States. He was charged with the high crime and misdemeanor of endeavoring to excite a disorganizing and revolutionary spirit in the country by inviting a disregard of and disobedience to a law of Congress. Anything sounding remotely familiar? They also charge him with abuse of the veto power to gratify his personal and political resentment, of being utterly unworthy and unfit to have the destinies of this nation in his hands as chief magistrate. So that's what they went after Tyler on. It was introduced, it was not voted on, and so it didn't go any further than that. So interesting story about John Tyler, though. So we saw that his term of office, 1841 to 1845, this was a long time ago. So last summer, when I was back in Washington, D.C., I met John Tyler's grandson, not great-grandson, his grandson, 93-year-old at the time, Lyon Gardner Tyler Jr. So amazing. So Tyler ended up having 15 kids by 2 wives, very late in life, so that's why you've got that happening. So other presidents who have had impeachment resolutions filed against them. So this is quiz time on who you recognize, okay? So who's in the upper left? Grover Cleveland, yes. Middle upper. Herbert Hoover. On the right, Truman. And then we've got Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. All had impeachment resolutions filed against them, but they didn't go anywhere. His exhibition of temper, his intemperate and often indecent denunciation of his political opponents, remind us rather of the demagogue than of the unimpassioned and well-balanced statesman. This was said about none other than Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson, by temperament, was very belligerent. He got in a power play with Congress. Congress didn't like him. And Johnson didn't help matters by his temperament. And so Congress passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act that said that the president could not fire any cabinet official or anybody that the Senate had been required to approve. He couldn't fire anybody without the Senate's approval. So Johnson fired Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton without the approval of the Senate. So, and it's a law, the Tenure of Office Act was later deemed unconstitutional. But nevertheless, Congress, because they didn't like Johnson and because of his attitudes and because of this power play with Congress, they voted to impeach him. And the House of Representatives actually did impeach him. We'll talk about that in a minute. From Harper's Weekly in 1866, talking about Johnson, says his speeches are disconnected, full of repetitions, and not even his official position as Chief Magistrate of the United States is sufficient to keep him within the limits of good sense and decorum. So the House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly to impeach Johnson. So we remember that impeachment is simply a charge. It's an indictment. It's not a conviction. It's simply saying it's going to be taken up by the Senate to decide whether you should be convicted. And if you're convicted, then you're removed from office. So when we say the word impeachment, it's just a charge. So the House voted 126 to 47 to impeach Andrew Johnson. It went to the Senate, needs a 2/3 majority to impeach or to convict and to remove the president. It fell short by 1 vote. So 35 votes to 19 votes. They needed 36 votes. The key swing vote was Edmund G. Ross from Kansas, I believe. And Ross voted against impeachment because he saw the bigger picture of what was going on, and he also realized that he was digging his own political grave by voting for acquittal, and in fact he was not reelected after that, but he took a principled stand as he saw it. John F. Kennedy, in his book Profiles in Courage, one of the chapters is about Edmund G. Ross. It's well worth reading. So that's Andrew Johnson. Richard Nixon. So, he has a bungled break-in to get campaign dirt on his opponent, and then there's a cover-up. And oftentimes it's the cover-up that ends up what gets people into trouble. So let's look at Nixon. There were actually 3 articles of impeachment that were approved by the House Judiciary Committee in July 1974. Obstruction of justice, so the cover-up of Watergate, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress for his failure to provide documents and respond to subpoenas that Congress had issued. So that was the basis of it. One Congressman, Walter Flowers, said, "I felt if we didn't impeach, we just ingrain and stamp in our highest office a standard of conduct that's just unacceptable. This is something we just cannot walk away from. It happened, and now we've got to deal with it." So when the Supreme Court ended up requiring Nixon to turn over the tapes, those tapes come out, all the information is disclosed, and Nixon's support in the Senate started to evaporate. And so you had August 7th, 1974, the House Minority Leader Hugh Scott, Barry Goldwater, and the House Minority Leader John Rhodes go to the White House and they say to the president, if this goes to the full floor of the House will vote to impeach you. And Goldwater said, and if it goes to the Senate, you will be convicted and removed from office. And that the support had totally evaporated. So it was at that point that Nixon decided to resign instead. So then we had Bill Clinton, who lied about whether he had an affair. And that was the basis of the 2 articles of impeachment that the House Judiciary Committee approved. Perjury, lying to a grand jury about his affair with Monica Lewinsky, and obstruction of justice, encouraging false testimony by Lewinsky to a grand jury. So that was the basis of those articles of impeachment. The House, full House voted to impeach him, so it went to the Senate, and the Senate acquitted him on the charges. Current day, we are in the midst of historic times. So we've got probably one of the most serious impeachment inquiries going on right now. And we've got a whistleblower who has come out with issues, obviously, about Trump using the power and office of the presidency to withhold military aid to Ukraine until they agree to investigate Joe Biden and investigate a now debunked theory of the Democratic National Committee server and whether it's there or not. So that's the basis of what is going on right now, and obviously there's been a lot of testimony. It's been closed door testimony at this point because the Democrats in the House don't want to have this all public, so different people who come in to testify can kind of correlate their stories, and because they want to get what the actual truth is. They've said that they're going to do actual public testimony once they've heard from most of the witnesses. I would impeach him, if for nothing else than because he is such an infernal liar. Was that said about today? Or when was it said? Any guesses?
Nixon.
No?
Jackson.
What was that?
Jackson.
Not Jackson?
Second Adam.
Ulysses Grant said it about Andrew Johnson. I would impeach him if for nothing else than because he's such an infernal liar. Okay? So Grant was a general at that time. So, just kind of summing up the different serious impeachment inquiries or resolutions that have gone forward. You've got Andrew Johnson, it's a power play between the presidency and Congress. You've got Nixon, it's a break-in for campaign intelligence, and then it's obstruction of justice and cover-up. You've got Clinton lying under oath about a personal matter, an affair or not, but that's perjury and obstruction. And you have Trump being charged with using the power of his office to solicit interference from a foreign country in the 2020 election. And Michael will take it from there and bring us up to speed on what is going on now.
Well, I'll try my best. There's always a lot happening. I told myself, we were preparing this, and I put blank spots in. I was like, this will definitely change before we get together. And so this Monday, I put stuff in, and then it's already out of date. And so had to go back in even after that and add some new stuff. So I thought I would begin by playing a quick video from the past. Let's make sure that it.
Article 3 of impeachment against Richard Nixon
The article was based on the idea that Richard Nixon, as president, failed to comply with subpoenas of Congress. Congress was going through its oversight function to provide oversight of the president. When asked for information, Richard Nixon chose not to comply, and the Congress back in that time said, "You're taking impeachment away from us. You're becoming the judge and jury. It is not your job to tell us what we need. It is your job to comply with the things we need to provide oversight over you." The day Richard Nixon failed to answer that subpoena is the day that he was subject to impeachment, because he took the power from Congress over the impeachment process away from Congress, and he became the judge and jury.
So that was Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, talking about how the significant issue with Richard Nixon was his failure to comply with requests from Congress. Well, we got a very similar thing not that long ago. So President Trump's attorney sent a letter from the White House that, this is the very beginning of that, but it says, I write on behalf of President Donald J. Trump in response to your numerous legally unsupported demands made as part of what you labeled contrary to the Constitution of the United States and all past bipartisan precedent as an impeachment inquiry. As you know, you have designed and implemented your inquiry in a manner that violates fundamental fairness and constitutionally mandated due process. And it goes through a list of ways in which they believe that has happened in Congress, but ultimately the purpose of the letter is to say no, that we won't comply with requests from Congress. They're also telling people that have associations with the president to say that they are, they're prevented from testifying because of executive privilege, and so you're seeing the White House not comply with what Congress is doing. Additionally, there is some reporting that President Trump was unhappy, and this is from the Washington Post, was unhappy with how ardently Republicans in Congress were defending him in Congress, and so he told them to take more aggressive steps to block the investigation, and we saw what that looks like yesterday. So when Republicans stormed the closed door impeachment hearing, and they went into what's known as a SCIF. So it is a secure area. You're not allowed to bring cell phones or any other recording devices in that area, because the information that's going to be presented there is seen as, highly classified. That it would be dangerous if this information was to leave this area. And Republican officials, went into this area. Some of them, I think, were tweeting from inside the SCIF, which, you're not allowed to bring your cell phone. You're certainly not allowed to tweet from there. I think there is some reporting that there was a hope, at least, that some would be arrested because of how that would look. Optically. So Republicans, I think there's some reporting that some of them wanted to be arrested because of how that would look, kind of adding to the political theater of what was happening. Democrats were questioning a Pentagon official during this hearing, and it ended up delaying that questioning for about 5 hours. And I think what you're seeing there is a change in rhetoric. So there's this political theater aspect to what's happening. But it's all, I think, connected to an argument that you'll hear more and more in the coming days. And so, for example, Representative Jeff Fortenberry, who's a Republican from Nebraska, said, "This is messy, no doubt. But at the same time, does it rise to the level of criminality, impeachment of a president? Doesn't look that way to me, and the process, by the way, is very unfair. And this is what is undermining the credibility of the House of Representatives." Senate Majority Whip John Thune also complained about the process, saying the picture coming out of this is the picture coming out of it based on the reporting we've seen, I would say, is not a good one. But I would also say, until we have a process that allows for everybody to see this in full transparency, it is pretty hard to draw any hard and fast conclusions. And so I think that you're hearing lots of critique about process. And so you're hearing less defense of the substance of President Trump's phone call with the leader of the Ukraine, or the withholding of aid to Ukraine contingent on certain investigations being kicked off. What you're hearing is critique of process, and I think that you're going to hear that more. Okay. And so this is part of the opening statement. I think it's a little bit off there, but there's a couple key parts here that I wanted to present from the statement. So this is from the opening statement of Ambassador William B. Taylor. He's the acting ambassador to the Ukraine, and he presented fairly explosive testimony to Congress this week, and I wanted to read a couple segments of what he had to say here. He said, "By mid-July, it was becoming clear to me that the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on the investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections. It was also clear that this condition was driven by the irregular policy channel I had come to understand was guided by Mr. Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani." He goes on to say in his letter, Ambassador Sondland, who's the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, he's also the founder of Providence Hotels, which owns Hotel Murano here in Tacoma. So a local connection to the impeachment investigation, if that makes it more exciting. And so Ambassador Sondland also told me that he now recognized that he had made a mistake by earlier telling the Ukrainian officials to whom he spoke that a White House meeting with President Zelensky was dependent on a public announcement of investigations. In fact, Ambassador Sondland said everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance. He said that President Trump wanted President Zelensky in a public box by making a public statement about ordering such investigations. Okay, and so all of this conversation about quid pro quo, this is what we're talking about here. And so withholding military aid, contingent on the Ukraine announcing investigations into Hunter Biden, as well as announcing investigations into the origin of the 2016 Russian interference investigation. And I think that's one of the things that I think is making it really difficult this week for Republicans to talk in terms of the substance of these allegations, and it's much easier to talk in this particular moment about process. And I'll say this is fairly this can be fairly complicated. There's lots of different players that are involved in this, and so during the question and answer period, if you're kind of lost about something, I can't guarantee that we have the answer to it, but feel free to ask questions that you have about what exactly is going on with Trump and the Ukraine. But I thought it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about public opinion, where we've seen some pretty significant changes over time. And so if we look at this April number here, so March and April of this year, about 36 to 37% of Americans during that time period thought that Trump should be impeached. This week was the first time, according to a CNN ORC poll, that number had reached 50%. And so it hadn't reached 50% yet. And so I think that is important. We know that public opinion drives the behavior, at least in part, of elected representatives. And if anything was to happen with this investigation, it would happen as a result of the attitudes and perspectives of the public changing to such an extent that there were those kinds of pressures placed on elected leaders. Okay, and so I wanted to talk briefly about why this even matters. And so as we think about these, as we think about impeachment over the next handful of months, we should be asking, will Democrats suffer the same fate as the GOP Congress in the aftermath of Clinton's impeachment? The Democrats during Clinton's impeachment did a pretty good job of, portraying what was happening as a partisan witch hunt, and I think that led to some backlash against the Republican Party. Now, the Republicans controlled the White House for the next 8 years after that happened, so the Democrats didn't escape entirely unscathed. But there was some backlash against Republicans during that time period. Second question, do Democrats have an ethical obligation to impeach in order to preserve a system of checks and balances? So do you have, even if you don't think that it's going to be successful, do you pursue impeachment because you believe that it is the right thing for the institution to do? Even if it might not benefit you politically, do you have some sort of obligation to pursue it? And can an impeachment inquiry change the minds of enough Republican lawmakers? And I think that is something that remains to be seen. I wanted to end the conversation with a quote from Hamilton, who's like super popular right now. So he said, in many cases, impeachment will connect itself with the pre-existing factions. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger. The decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstration of innocence or guilt. And he said that in Federalist 65. And I think that that's what we're witnessing right now. I think that is pretty spot on. We're seeing parties sort of take precedence over, constitutional, national security, and ethical considerations. And I think that we have to ask ourselves whether this is a system which we want to see continue. If we allow, decisions about impeachment to be dictated, solely by, which party has more members in Congress at any given time, then we essentially make, as long as the president has enough folks in Congress who will, have his or her back, then we make the president immune from any repercussions, particularly impeachment in this sense. And I think that is something which would be scary not only for the founders, the writers of the Constitution, but it should be scary for us as well if we believe that the presidency should have limits attached to it. So that's something scary to think about this Halloween. And so, so I think that we'll end there, and I think Mike is going to lead us into question time.
Right. So we'll do questions and answers as we have done before, and I'll bring the microphone to you so everybody can hear your question. I am also, as I'm kind of walking around, I'm going to pass out a sign-up sheet for your email address. If you are interested in being on it, if you already signed up before and you've gotten emails from me, no need to sign up again. We may be changing the location for the future lectures from this room to the rotunda in the Wheelock Student Center. That's something that I would communicate with you via email. So if you're interested, sign up on it, no requirement to do so. I also want to just comment before we do the questions that when Gerald Ford was a member of the House of Representatives, he made a statement that impeachment is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives thinks at any given time in history. So, and then I also want to comment on the letter that Michael showed us from the White House saying no. And they said basically that what the Democrats in the House were doing was an unconstitutional process. That's not really true because the Constitution doesn't dictate the specifics about how impeachment goes forward. It just says the House shall have the sole right to impeach and the Senate has the sole right to convict and remove. That's all it says. Everything else is process, which is not constitutional. With that, any questions that we can try to answer? Yes, sir.
I had a couple, one based on your comment that you just made. In terms of making changes to the process, I take it that would have to be through a constitutional amendment, or is that something that can be changed?
Yeah, so the issue would be if If people wanted to embed in the Constitution certain processes that might say that the entire House has to vote to start an impeachment process, which is what the White House and Republicans have been suggesting, that would have to be a constitutional amendment in order to make it something that stops. Yes?
So everybody keeps going back to the quote, but that seems a little misplaced in the fact everybody seems to be focusing on quid pro quo, but the request in and of itself, without the quid pro quo of a foreign government to help in domestic campaign matters is illegal. Why is that not more than
There's a lot of aspects to this that I think that we'll talk about, and that is certainly, if we were concerned about what Russia was doing in 2016, what is essentially happening here is encouraging the same sort of behavior in 2020, and so I think that if that is something concerning to you, I think that you should be worried about this. There's a lot of different sort of nuances here. I think that the quid pro quo thing, especially as it relates to funding to the Ukraine, I think is, I don't think that we've fully kind of wrapped our heads around yet how significant that is. First of all, the president doesn't have the authority to withhold that funding. That was funding that was allocated by Congress, and so withholding it in general is something that was beyond the power of the president. But then it's also using, sort of your own personal political considerations to decide, national security policy, foreign policy. And I think that is something that we quite frankly have never, we've never seen that before in the office of the presidency. And that's, I don't think there's any historical precedent for that, and I think that it's a big sort of complicated topic. But I think that I hope that more people are kind of surprised by it. We should at least, no matter what you believe, whether there should be impeachment or no impeachment, we should be surprised by the nature of what's happening. And at least deal with it as significant as it is.
This might seem a little simplistic, but if the House controls the impeachment process and nobody else, why don't they just tell the White House people who are making such a brouhaha to sit down and shut up? Why has it become such a theater?
So why has it become such a theater? Well, we live in political theater times, I guess. I think what the House, controlled by the Democrats, are trying to do is they're trying to go through an orderly process rather than simply saying, sit down and shut up. And they're trying to build a case. They're trying to build a case not only based on facts, but based on public opinion. As Michael commented earlier, that where different representatives or senators stand on this issue is going to be driven in large measure by their political party, but also by what the people think. And so if there's enough people, and polls show that enough people are upset about something, then that could start to shift things. There's a lot of silence by some members of the Senate, Republicans in the Senate, about the issue, who are clearly uncomfortable with what's going on. Some have spoken up. Mitt Romney has spoken up. Susan Collins of Maine has basically said, hey, if I'm going to be the juror on this, I don't want to make any comments on that right now. I'm going to wait for the facts to come out. And there have been a couple of other senators who've said similar things. So I think Democrats are trying to create an orderly process out of a pretty disorderly set of circumstances.
I have a question up here. up in the cheap seats.
I'll run it up this way.
We have a third branch of government that you haven't talked about, and that's our judiciary. And I want to know what you think, what role does Supreme Court play in this impeachment process? And could they be a swing vote?
So the Supreme Court, so if we go back to Nixon, you remember the Supreme Court was critical in terms of Nixon's resignation, basically, because the Supreme Court said that Nixon had to turn over the tapes. Based on a subpoena that Nixon refused to comply with. So we've got a lot of subpoenas that the Trump administration has refused to comply with. So those could either become portions of articles of impeachment for obstruction of justice, as occurred with Nixon. And at some point, the Democrats may take more of those through the courts. There's a number of these right now that are already percolating in the court system, but it takes time to go through that. And, you know, the Trump administration is really trying to run out the clock on a lot of this stuff, and have a lot of delays, because then Trump remains in office and he doesn't have an order from the Supreme Court saying that he has to do it. Because something has to first be filed with the federal district court. It takes them a couple of months to go through it, and then it would go to the Court of Appeals, and then to the Supreme Court. Now, in the case of Nixon, it bypassed one of those steps and it went directly up to the Supreme Court because there was an issue of national importance. Whether that happens again this time, and then how the court might decide, is anybody's guess. There's somebody down here. We'll do front row first, and thank you.
Thank you. I'd like you to correct my understanding or misunderstanding. I think Trump's behavior is abhorrent, asking foreign power to help defeat what should be the loyal opposition. But if it gets to the Senate, what is the acid test? Has he committed high crimes and misdemeanors or not?
So the term high crimes and misdemeanors is somewhat nebulous. It goes back to Gerald Ford's comment, you know, what is an impeachable offense is politically, at a certain point in time in history, what people think it is. So in my mind, if you go back and you look at what the founders intended, I believe that if they were around now, they would say what Trump has done constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors. I think that was the intent to have the impeachment clause in the Constitution because of concerns about some of this kind of behavior. I think one of the tragedies in our polarized nation is that oftentimes we don't look at what is best for the nation. We're looking at what's best for a political party or a political position. So high crimes and misdemeanors, in my opinion, and I think probably the founders would probably say, yeah, that's where we're at. But you have a lot of people saying, no, even if Trump did what he's being accused of doing, that doesn't rise to a high crime and misdemeanor, which I think is more a politically driven statement than a factual one.
One of the reasons that Trump is given for not complying with the subpoenas is that the Congress does not, the full Congress has not voted for the impeachment inquiry. Is there any validity to that?
So the issue of the House of Representatives not voting on impeachment to move forward with an impeachment inquiry, just having it be dictated by committee, there is nothing in the Constitution that talks about that. What Republicans and the Trump White House are saying is, well, in the past, that's what's happened. Now, we don't have a lot of past to deal with, you know, on impeachments, okay? So process is going to change depending on individual circumstances, and whoever controls the House can dictate what that process is going to be. So personally, I don't think it has any validity, but that's kind of where we're at. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things, and just kind of an aside from that, is that I think what you're seeing in part is just, what happens when you just choose not to follow like norms of behavior, right? That if Congress issues a subpoena, normally you would just, well, okay, Congress has the power to issue a subpoena, and I'll show up and I'll answer questions. Well, what if you just don't go, right? And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing here, is that, what if you opt just not to do the thing, and does Congress respond with the full, sort of weight of its authority, or do they not do that? And I think that you've seen, at least congressional Democrats be hesitant to kind of wield the full weight of the law to compel testimony, or if somebody is unwilling to testify, like, are you going to go and arrest? Are you like when William Barr refused to testify in Congress? Are you going to send police officers, DC police officers, into his house and arrest him for not testifying before Congress? They've been reluctant to push this as far as they possibly could, and I think there's perhaps some good political reasons for that, but I think that one of the things that's being exposed is the extent to which our democracy is sort of built on norms of behavior and not on specific, laws or rules that compel that behavior.
So in other words, can you impeach somebody because they're an infernal liar? The Grant comment about Andrew Johnson. Can you impeach them because of bad behavior? They're obnoxious, they're belligerent. That's really not what the Constitution is about. It's about, treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. So we have to kind of look at that and say, what are the actions, and do they rise to any of those categories?
How do you feel about presidential immunity? Because that's what was argued today, in fact, by the president's lawyer, that given the example of if I stand in the middle of New York and shoot somebody, and the lawyer essentially said, he's immune. What role does that play?
Well, that's obviously something that is being talked about, and it's, it goes back to the Justice Department decision that says the sitting president can't be charged with crimes while in office. The vice president can. They don't have that immunity. So I think that represents a dangerous position for our democracy, because it opens up the floodgates potentially for anything to happen, and a president could openly defy every law, and you couldn't do anything about it. And I don't think that's what the founders thought was appropriate. So I think the Justice Department decision that sitting president can't be charged probably needs to be revisited.
Yeah, and that is just their interpretation of presidential power, and so I think that's important too. And so it's not as if that is the DOJ guidelines are what is necessarily prescribed in the Constitution. I think that it would be interesting to see what, how that would play out in the courts. If that, if he was indicted, what would the courts say about that? Bill Clinton tried to say that as president, that meant that he did not have to testify before a grand jury, and the courts ruled against him and said that he did. And so some of these questions are just questions that the courts haven't adequately grappled with yet. There just haven't been enough instances for them to fully evaluate what the Constitution says about them. And so right now, I think that we're operating largely on these guidelines, which are just, again, like sort of norms for how the DOJ is going to act, but not necessarily the law as to how we should proceed when a president potentially breaks the law.
Another question? Let me forward your type of question to a new person here.
So how do you think Trump has affected the Overton window and
The what?
the Overton window? And how do you think that's going to impact the 2020 election?
Okay, the Overton window, I'm not familiar with that.
Like, what is considered left wing and what is considered right wing? Has it shifted, and how will that affect the election?
Okay, so basically talking about Trump's takeover of the Republican Party and how that has impacted things, and are Republicans Republicans?
Yeah, and because in a lot of talk shows now, it's not even right against left, it's right against less right, I think. And how do you think that's going to affect what's talked about in the election?
Yeah, so the question I think relates to, the fact that President Trump he has taken over the Republican Party, and you've got a lot of people in the Republican Party who have some discomfort with some of his behavior. And so Trump has this solid base, we think it's solid at this point, of people that he riles up through Twitter and through his campaign rallies. And so I think he's kind of changed the dynamic about the traditional Democrat versus Republican. And I think that's the new reality that we're in right now. And so that is going to have an impact on the race. I think it's going to depend, too, on what continues to come out in the impeachment inquiry.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because it's not necessarily, it is about what is sort of driving the Republican Party in the moment, and not necessarily what is sort of liberal or conservative, which those things are sort of different. I think that, there's not a lot, but this doesn't have much to do with, sort of a conservative liberal perspective. It has to do with which party is going to win and how they're positioning themselves to ultimately be successful. And for a lot of Republicans, what that has meant is kind of hitching your wagons to Trump. And I think I think that's ultimately dangerous. And one of the things that I think that it's doing to weaken the party right now is just, kind of losing credibility in the arguments that they're making. I used to find it incredibly easy in class to present, here's the facts, here's what one side says, here's what the other side says, make up your own mind about what to do. And it's becoming harder to do that. So for example, with this Ukraine story, I can say, I can, tell the Republican story, but, for example, the server that they want investigated, there is no physical server. There is no, physical server that exists in the Ukraine that we're going to go and, send the military in and, grab and bring back and investigate. It is in the cloud. It is not a physical, server that exists in the Ukraine. And so I can't present that side of the partisan debate, because it is not based on actual evidence. It's not based on reality. And I think that the further that they push themselves away from facts and reality, the more damage they're doing long-term to the party. They might have some short-term benefits for associating with Trump, but I think in the long term, they're losing their ability to be believed, I think, by large segments of the population.
So a lot of this is coming down to who's got the best PR machine, whether what you say is true or not. And that's what a lot of it is revolving around.
On the issue of partisan priorities and everything, Robert Reich, back about 6 months ago, came out with an article that was entitled "Surprise, the Center in U.S. Politics is Very Progressive." Basically, all of the things that you would have associated with liberals, Democrats, about 9% of them Republican voters also favor. In fact, there's even been some discussion since this came out that even Joe Biden isn't necessarily really programmed to represent the beliefs of today's Democrats. If you read through this, and this was in alternate, in case anybody wants to look it up, June 22nd, 2019. Joe Biden isn't liberal enough for the average Republican, if you take a look at these.
So we're seeing a breakdown of
And
a
one at the
lot of
top.
different kinds of parties and things like that.
So I have two questions. Maybe you'll let me ask both at one at a time. So first, to me at least, it's undeniable that civility has vacated Washington, D.C., specifically civility within Congress. I mean, we noted that Republicans stormed the impeachment inquiry, hearing. So my question is, do you believe civility can be restored within Congress? How? And in what ways do you see civility in Congress still today, even though there is such a conflict?
I think that's a great question, and it's a very timely question that we do need to figure out how as a nation and Congress, how are we going to get to a point where we are treating one another with civility? And I think a lot of it stems from who are the leaders. So we've seen with President Trump that a leader can set a tone. And whether that tone is a tone of civility or a tone of belligerence, that starts to infect everybody. So it's infected Congress. I think Trump has riled up the nation in many ways, and that means Congress as well. So I think a president, you go back to Joe Biden's statement, he wants to restore the soul of America. Part of the soul of America, going to the questions, the comments that Michael said, what kind of nation do we want to be? Who do we want to be? And that a leader, a president, can have an impact on shaping that in Congress. Is that easy? No way. But that's a start.
I think that partly too, we need to reconsider what we mean by civility. Like there's politicians will talk a lot about civility, but what civility is often used as, it's a way to, it's a tool, it's like a weapon that you're using against the other side, right? That somebody is mad at you and you're saying we need to promote civility, and it's used as like a way to kind of shut down the other side, as opposed to representing a way in which you are going to like communicate equally with others. It's often used as a way to critique what the other side is doing, and I think reclaiming it for something that is different than that is an important part of moving forward.
Yeah, it comes down to power and politics over larger nationwide interests, I think. Your second question.
Yes, my second question was, many political scientists, I just read an essay in Can It Happen Here by Jack Balkin. Many political scientists say that Trump is the last president in the Reagan regime. You're a presidential historian. Do you believe that's true?
So is he the last president?
In
the Reagan regime.
In the Reagan. So I think that Trump has kind of blown up the presidency, and so when you look at other Republican presidents, you look at Reagan, you look at George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush. So you may have a different political position than they do on certain items, but at least they were more or less civil. Ronald Reagan, could smile and say some pretty, in my mind, poor political positions, but everybody said, but he's so nice, And so, you know, this goes to the earlier question that we're seeing a total shift of dynamics, and that where traditional Republican, Democratic positions don't really mean anything. It's more about power than about positions.
Yeah, and I would say I don't know if he's the last. So I think that, you know, if you would pick the sort of big similarity between the two, it's sort of this anti-government mentality, right? This sort of, you know, deregulating as much as possible. Trump talks a lot about reducing regulations in government. If Trump were to win a second term, I imagine you'd see that, you know, like as you know, partisanship has sort of divided, you know, Congress and its ability to get things done. The president still does have a lot of power to deregulate things, and if the president doesn't like government, you know, they can deregulate all the day long and continue to do that. And I think we'd get another wave of that in a second term. And I think that is consistent with a sort of Reagan approach to government. I just don't know that I don't know that there's any reason to assume that it would be the last at this point.
Since we're seeing that this impeachment process, as well as other impeachment processes, were largely partisan, and we've even talked about how whoever has the best PR, you know, when it comes to the process that's in place today that we're watching, wouldn't it be a more powerful statement to declare what the soul of America is if the people vote the president out of office? Because it seems like the power should be in the people's hands. And I don't see why we wouldn't, at this point, so close to an election, let the people of this country let their voices be heard and say, regardless if you do an impeachment process, this is what we stand for, this is what we won't stand for, and we're just gonna vote them out of office. I think that we have the power to do that. Would it be a more powerful statement to go that route?
So it would obviously be a very powerful statement if Trump does not win a second term, so he's still eligible to run, still president on November 3rd. So a lot of people have said that and said that that's really the way in which we ought to approach it. I think there's a lot of concerns about some of the things that Trump has done, and maybe there's things that we don't know of what he's done as well. It is pretty dicey, though, to do an impeachment this close to an election. And I mean, there are a million different scenarios of how things could play out. If Trump is not convicted of impeachment, I think it's pretty clear that he's probably going to be impeached by the House. But let's say he's not convicted, then he's going to use that in the campaign. And I wrote an article on this a while ago before the Ukraine thing came up. And he's going to use this to say, see, they said I did bad things, but I really didn't. I didn't get convicted of impeachment. I didn't get removed from office. So he can use that in the campaign. So that's one scenario. Another scenario would be that Trump is convicted and removed from office. So the timing on all that gets really important because there's a lot of different ways things could end up going. So Pence becomes president. Pence ends up, so is this before or after the Republican convention? I mean, how does that work? And who does Pence pick to run for with him on the ticket? I mean, there's just a whole bunch of scenarios. So I think there's clearly some risks associated with going through with impeachment this close to an election, but there's also risks of not doing it. And Michael talked about the kind of the moral obligation to talk about when something is really blatantly wrong and to bring that to the surface.
Yeah, I understand. There's, you know, kind of connected to this. We should be afraid in a hyper partisan environment of, you know, you just don't like the president and you start, you know, impeachment investigations. That I mean, we are, you know, more polarized now than we've been since the Civil War, and so it's not out of the question that, you know, if you had a decent majority in Congress, that you would pursue impeachment, if anything else, just to investigate the president, potentially make the president look bad. And we should be wary of that. I think that though, you know, at least where we're at right now, the thing that scares me is to not do something and to leave it open exclusively to a vote of the people. Seems to say that for 4 years a president can do essentially whatever they want, right? That we would kind of then, you know, the idea of impeachment would become kind of antiquated and assumed to be no longer possible, and we would, and I think that's dangerous too. And so I take your point. I think that a vote of the people has a huge amount of symbolic power. I think not impeaching also sends perhaps a dangerous message as well. So it's all kind of fraught, and there's no necessarily, you know, the easy path forward, I think.
And one of our challenges, of course, is how do we separate out impeachable offenses from politics? And so, you know, you can say Andrew Johnson should have been impeached because he violated a law of Congress. Probably pretty low on the scale of a bad, you know, high crime and misdemeanor, but you know, he did do something wrong. He shouldn't have done it. He was also a jerk too. Bill Clinton, you know, is probably more a politically motivated impeachment than you know, Nixon or what's happening with Trump. And what's happening with Trump on the scale of things, when you compare it with Nixon, Clinton, and Andrew Johnson, what's happening with Trump is, you know, order of magnitude much worse in terms of potential abuse of power. So I think it's helpful to compare that with previous impeachment efforts.
We have one over there.
My apologies for the cell phones. They just sent me off the deep end.
That's okay.
Which takes me to my question.
Yeah.
And because of the good doctor bringing up, I always thought the server was, in fact, a physical server.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, doctor.
Sure. Yeah.
Which brings to my question. I thought the 2016, the issue as far as the election, I thought that was water under the bridge. But being that's still around, they're still kicking that around. My question now is technology. On the 2016 election, was that, what's the claim as far as the Russians having their hand in the election? Was it electronically or influence, or was it quid pro quo? You know?
So I think part of the claim in 2016 is that and it's happening in 2020, is the Russians doing social media, videos and advertisements, creating fake groups, even fake meetings of voters, and basically manipulating people through social media. Michael, other perspectives on that?
No, I think that's, you know, and you know, there's the stuff involving WikiLeaks as well, and the release of emails from the DNC that you know, kind of fueled internal divisions within the Democratic Party. There's a lot of debate. You know, there's people that debate in political science, you know, to what extent did Russian interference change the outcome of the election? Some scholars are kind of adamant that, you know, it didn't really have a significant influence. Others, I think she's actually a communications scholar, but Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who wrote a book called Cyber War, and she made the argument that it did change the outcome. But I think that in a lot of ways it's still kind of an unsettled question, and if anything, kind of leaning in the direction of it didn't change the outcome. Now, that being said, it's certainly something that we, you know, shouldn't want. And it doesn't mean that if it doesn't impact one election, that it wouldn't impact another. And we should be particularly concerned about the ability to hack, you know, voting technology. And so we don't have a lot of evidence that that occurred in 2016, but it's certainly not inconceivable that something like that would occur in the future. And that should be very alarming, and we should be taking all the steps necessary to make sure that that doesn't happen.
If you had said that it seems likely that the House will file articles of impeachment, and what if the Senate votes to impeach and remove him from office, and President Trump says, "It's a fake, I won't go"?
So Nancy Pelosi shows up at the White House with handcuffs and arrests him and drives him away. Now, I don't know. I mean, you know, I imagine. I'm not sure what the next steps would be. Actually, I don't know. These are questions that I looked at the Constitution, and I didn't see the part in the impeachment section that said, and if the president doesn't leave, then you send in the military. I mean, there would be eventually, I imagine, you know, if you're squatting on the White House grounds, then there would probably be some, you know, law enforcement branch that would remove you eventually.
And maybe the way it might work is there would be a lawsuit that would immediately go to the Supreme Court, and we hope the Supreme Court would, you know, enforce what Congress said, and then it may come down to force too. I don't know. I mean, there's that question. There's also the question that I worry about come January 20th, 2021. If, let's say, Trump is not removed from office through impeachment, but he loses the election and says, there was a fraudulent election, it was rigged, I lost 2 years of my term because of the fake Mueller report, and I'm not leaving. What happens? So what happens in that case is actually an easier case on that one, that the new president ends up getting sworn in, maybe not in a big formal ceremony, but goes to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, gets sworn in, and then as the legally authorized president orders military or police to go in and remove Trump. That one is easier than impeachment and refusing to leave.
Let's take one more here. Who has the best question?
I'm curious, those folks that I deal with that are supporters of President Trump feel very strongly that everything they read is actually propaganda from the other side. So I haven't found a way of communicating with them and sharing with them why they feel. It's almost like an entrenchment, and anything he says is right, and anything I say, oh, that's because that's the press has created that. So it's created a kind of an impasse for me to share ideas or share things, and I wonder what would happen? I mean, that's happened before, like Germany, the Nazis, you know, legislated things and nobody said anything about them. Well, I'm just curious, is there some way that eventually you break through that impasse that all communication is actually biased, and therefore you should listen to other people? I mean, they're not listening.
I wish I had an answer to that question, not just academically, but like personally too. I wish I had an answer. I've had many similar conversations, and it is very difficult. And you know, it goes beyond just exposure to information that you disagree with. I mean, what research suggests is that, you know, if you are a Democrat and you watch Fox News, it's not like you become like more moderate. You actually become more liberal because you spend the whole time you're watching Fox News like there are like 100 things wrong with what Tucker Carlson just said, and you're listing them out in your head, and you become more entrenched in your beliefs. And so it's not just exposure to ideas that you disagree with. And so like students have asked me that, like talked about this with me, and I simply don't have an answer to. I don't know what, if you believe that a large percentage of the news that is consumed in this country is fake, then I don't know what you do. You know, how do you convince people that something is not fake? Because every fact that you present is fake. And so I don't know what I don't know what the answer is to that. Do you have any?
So Trump is very smart, really, on some things in terms of propaganda. So there was an interview, I don't remember who he did it with, but he was asked, why do you keep on saying things are fake news? And he said, very revealing, he said, I do it because when things come out that are not advantageous to me and they're critical of me, I don't want people to believe that. And that's exactly what your question gets at. That's exactly what has happened. He has convinced a major portion of the country through constant repetition, fake news, fake news, fake news. We believe the president. It's fake news. And that was his strategy, and it's working.
And I think you get this interesting dynamic here in this current administration where the president in some ways becomes the curator of news. Like he tells people that support him, like, you know, this journalist is a good journalist, this journalist is a liar, you know, watch this television show is really going off the rails, don't watch this one anymore, they're critical of me. And so he kind of curates the news for his audience in a way that other presidents haven't done. Certainly all presidents are critical of the media because that should be the dynamic between a president and the press. There should be tension there, but we haven't seen something quite like this before.
Yeah, Trump curates the news, but he also creates the news, not just by what he does and says, but his speeches, his comments to the press, his tweets, are all saying things that he wants to be true, even though it really has no basis in reality. And so as long as he says it, he says, you know, things are great, or whatever it may be that he says, he is creating the narrative that he wants to be true, that he wants people to believe. Not a lot of facts to support much of it, but that's what he does. So he's fairly manipulative when it comes to that.
Well,
Mike, hence that's why he said on the lawn of the White House concerning China. Is that why he said that? Even though we're saying to ourselves, why did he say that when he just got done?
So the reason why Trump made the comment on the lawn of the White House asking China to investigate the Bidens is because he figures if you can take what is now the subject of a House impeachment inquiry, that's something that is kind of appalling to ask a foreign country to investigate your opponent, and you bring it out into the light of day, then that makes it okay. I mean, that's what's behind it. That but it doesn't work that way. But that's what he's trying to do.
And because we did this,
Form of cognitive dissonance.
I was going to say that because we did this lecture in public, it cannot be illegal. And so
That's right, exactly.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you. We certainly stick around, and we're happy to answer questions and talk to you all. And you should, if you haven't checked out Mike's book, it's hilarious, and he's happy to sell copies and sign copies as well. Oh, awesome. Thank you very much.
We're already on the list.
Oh, great. Thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Yes. Oh, thank you. Hey, Jim. How are you? Good, good. Thanks for leading that book through. I heard you did a great job.
I hope that we get to talk about in the article today about more students and you coming to register to vote.
Yeah, I mean, I am sure that we'll touch on that in here this time. It's something that I think that you can't talk about elections without talking about it right now, especially if you're talking about turnout. That is a pretty significant part of that. So yeah.
So we're going to move into the return?
Maybe. That's still being decided, so we'll email folks. And so I think that would be better. Just it's a little bit difficult to move around in here, and it's not the most comfortable environment. Yeah. And I think that the chairs have gotten squeakier since the last time.
I was going to say something about this one.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me see. Hello?
No,
They might have turned it off.
Right. So, one question, and then I thought I'd tell you a really fun fact that I learned at a local photography conference, the National Photography Conference.
Oh, interesting.
Here in Tacoma last week. So, one thing I wanted to ask, if in your upcoming series talk, are you guys going to be talking about gerrymandering and districting for voting and anything like that?
Yeah, I imagine we'll we did some of that in 2016, but I'm sure that we'll bring it back again. I think all of that is kind of impossible to leave out of a conversation about elections, and so
I think that it can be really confusing to people when you look at the political maps that are displayed.
Yeah.
They're really deceiving most of the time, and it's
Yeah.
So I'm a geographic motivation systems professional,
Oh,
and
awesome.
so I was at the NACES conference last week. I went just for one day, and there were 3 different presentations done by different professionals who actually do the mapping for the Washington Post.
Oh, that's really interesting.
So as a GIS professional, I'm always thinking about the data side of things, and those folks are thinking about how to get information out like this, right?
Yeah.
So I learned that in the 2016 elections, most of the maps were done with screenshots.
Really?
Yeah, I thought you'd like that.
That's interesting.
They were all based on correct geography, and the data was correct, but to get them out as fast as they needed to get them out, they're almost always done as screenshots. So not as the actual. So I figured you touched upon. Or
That's super interesting.
It was so fascinating. Most of the audience was just like, oh my god. I mean, there were like 400 people in this room, and then also laughing at the same time.
Yeah.
It's just, they had to be able to combine data really fast, which you can't always do. I mean, like within minutes.
Yeah.
You can't do effectively.
It's amazing how fast information needs to
Right.
like
So then they actually display the results with screenshots. I thought it was
gosh.
So it's the Washington Post representative who talked.
That's awesome. Yeah, if you have any information on that, if you could email it to me, that'd be awesome.
And I'll send you just stuff that I know that's out there. There's 2 presentations done by GIS professionals about gerrymandering.
That'd be super helpful because I talk a lot about gerrymandering in class and extra tools or methodological approaches that it's not an area it's not a methodological approach that I do, and so
but to have a good understanding of it and presenting stuff.
That would be really helpful.
This is subject for both of you guys.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much.
And it was great.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, you
Sure.
got
My job is in government relations.
Oh, awesome. Which government?
Rochelle's
Yes, I know you. I couldn't.
Which is temporary staffing.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
In fact, I'm heading back to DC next week to officially lobby for WOTC, the Work Opportunity Tax.
This was a great.
So anyway, vested interest in understanding all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the last question, have you been reading about the core beliefs of how people are making their emails based on their core beliefs? It's really hard to function, right?
Yeah.
Brought my girl.
I mean, at least, so,
sophomores.
I don't know if I've heard the core beliefs language. What I've seen, the stuff that I've seen very much says, people vote, party line. Like, it's just, and it's even apart from, like, belief, like, it's like, you do it instinctively, like, you grew up in a Republican household, you were taught Republicans are always right, and so now it's like, well, like, yeah, I vote Republican, and it doesn't even necessarily have to match up with any coherent set of
I'll send you a couple
beliefs.
of links.
But yeah, that would be super helpful.
It's particularly a couple of TED Talks by people that I respect. I don't
Yeah.
respect everybody on TED Talks.
No, there's some great stuff on there too.
About talking about political beliefs and core beliefs and how there's a certain point where they're not changeable. Especially when you talked about watching Fox. I can't watch MSNBC or Fox. Because I am definitely an independent.
Yeah.
I don't like him.
Yeah, well, and I think that students will say, I use a variety of perspectives, and you're kind of thinking like, but that's not going to do it. That's not going to solve the problem. And so that's really hard.
I've really been working with people on listening and trying to understand where that person comes from, which is why I bring up the core beliefs.
Yeah.
Is, I grew up in a very conservative town with a liberal family, but also part of the family is very conservative, and so I have to listen to my family.
Yeah.
Or we're gonna hate each other.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what's happening right now. People aren't even listening or trying to understand. They believe that with their heart, and you believe this with your heart. So I'll send you this link.
That would be super helpful. I'd really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. Yeah. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Thanks for
last month's Harper. I'm looking forward to next spring and summer.
Yeah.
But last month's Harper's had an article, a conversational article, the gist of which was, do we need a constitution or should it be changed?
Yeah. I'll check that out.
It's worth reading because it brings up.
I like to pose like big questions like that in the very beginning of like a intro class and force them to kind of
17, 18
think about like, is this worth it anymore, or does this?
The basis being that the Constitution was written 250 years ago.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Things have changed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
You figure out a way to get rid of the electoral college. I'm on board for that.
Some places are working on it.
Yeah, well, that's been going on forever. I'm just getting really tired of 6 guys in Wyoming deciding
They've got your interest in heart.
How you doing?
Good. How are you? Michael, nice to meet you.
UPS alum.
Oh, awesome.
From '88, so.
Great.
But one of the things I was wondering if you see happening is the factionalization of the Republican Party, where you have, Jeff Flake and others that would love to speak out and
just retire.
And they're thinking that once Trump is gone, well, everything's going to be better again. But the problem is, I envision if Trump leaves, there's going to be this faction of his supporters that say, kind of like the Tea Party. Let's get a bunch of people that kind of speak the way Trump speaks and put them up there and then, run against these moderate Republicans as traitors. I mean, do you envision, is that conceivable, or is there something that might prevent that kind of third party from...
There's been mixed results with candidates running as Trump. Like, so it's one of the things that I'm kind of curious about. Like, is the way he approaches politics, like, is he the only one that can do this? Or is it, like, because you've seen other politicians kind of adopt like a Trumpian approach, and it's not really consistent with who they were before then, and so it doesn't quite fit. There's been like kind of mixed records of success in running for office, and so I'm kind of curious about like, is this like, can we think of this as like isolated specifically to him,
Right,
or
well, it's him, it's his persona, it's his money, so it's that
perfect storm, I
the
guess?
general public makes generalizations around
That's what I'm
individuals that have,
hoping,
well, they're successful.
Yeah.
So of course they could run the country. He wouldn't be as rich as he is if he didn't have the ability to, success. So they equate nonsense